I came home one evening expecting the usual, only to have my wife drop a bombshell. She had a lover, and she wasn't planning to let him go. What followed was a whirlwind of betrayal, heartbreak, and an unexpected fight to rebuild my life from the ground up. Morning sunlight filtered weakly through the curtains, illuminating the bedroom as I struggled to pull myself out of bed. My head throbbed, the remnant of a relentless headache from the night before. Stumbling into the bathroom, I swallowed 2 aspirin and gripped the edge of the sink, hoping to quell the queasiness roiling in my stomach. My name is Adam Callahan, and yesterday, my life was turned completely upside down. It started like any other day. After a long shift at work, I came home, not knowing the emotional wreckage that awaited me. Lindsay, my wife, met me in the living room. Her expression was an unsettling mix of love and sadness. Then, with a trembling voice, she confessed something I never saw coming: she'd been involved with another man for the past year. She described this man, Nathan, as a broken soul, someone shattered by a car accident that claimed his wife's life while he walked away unscathed. Lindsay explained that she had tried to mend his spirit, and over time, their bond had deepened. What started as emotional support eventually grew into love, and then into physical intimacy. She assured me that her feelings for me hadn't changed and promised she would return fully to our marriage when Nathan no longer needed her. Her words felt like a sucker punch to the gut. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. She vowed to balance her time between me, our children, and her obligation to Nathan. I was stunned, unable to grasp the betrayal. In my confusion and pain, I lashed out, calling her names in a desperate attempt to make sense of it all. But Lindsay was ready for my anger. Her response was sharp, accusing me of failing to love and support her. She threw our wedding vows back at me, claiming that if I truly loved her, I would accept this situation, no matter how much it hurt. I was furious. Her words stung more deeply than I could have imagined. Trying to find some sense of control, I asked, "How would you feel if I found another woman?" Her response was cold and cutting. "Who would want you?" she sneered. "You're an overweight, middle-aged man with thinning hair." Then she warned me, if I dared to divorce her, she would ruin me. Her tone was laced with venom, and the conversation left me reeling. The woman I thought I knew had turned into someone I could barely recognize. Blinded by anger and hurt, I began drinking to dull the emotional storm. I yelled, I raged, anything to release the frustration and betrayal I felt inside. Lindsay remained unfazed. Calmly, she packed a bag and announced, "I'm leaving to be with Nathan until you calm down and accept this." Her words echoed in my mind long after she walked out. Hours later, I sat alone on the edge of our bed, taking a hard look at myself. Maybe Lindsay was right about some things. I was middle-aged. My hair was thinning, and I had put on about 20 pounds. But none of that justified what she'd done, or her cruelty in rubbing it in my face. My mind was spinning, torn between fury, heartbreak, and sheer confusion. How had we ended up here? And where was I supposed to go from this point? I couldn't change my age, but there were things I could fix. My weight and my hair, for starters. That was something I could control. But first, I needed to find out where my kids were. It was a Saturday morning, they should have been home. I checked each room, calling their names, but the house was quiet, too quiet. Panic began to set in as I realized they weren't here. Where had Lindsay taken them? I grabbed my phone, debating whether to call her parents, when the sound of tires crunching on the driveway caught my attention. Peeking through the curtain, I saw Lindsay's car pulling in, the kids climbing out one by one. Relief washed over me, quickly replaced by a simmering frustration. I met her at the door, my heart pounding. "Good, you're sober," she said, brushing past me with a cutting tone. "Where were they?" I asked, my voice tighter than I intended. "They were with me," Lindsay replied as she set her bag on the counter. "I couldn't leave them with you after yesterday." "You didn't take them to him, did you?" The words came out before I could stop myself. She spun around, glaring at me. Adam, don't start with that. Her voice was sharp and clipped. No, they were already there. My friend is kind and patient, unlike the man I dealt with yesterday. Her words hit like a slap. I clenched my fists, biting back a retort. So why not leave them with your parents? I asked, trying to keep my tone even. They weren't home, she answered simply and started heading upstairs, leaving me standing in the hallway. I followed, unable to let it go. Are you here for good, or are you just stopping by before running back to him? Oh, grow up, Adam, she said, barely pausing to look at me. I've told you how things are going to be. This is the reality. Accept it, or don't. The discussion is over. She turned, meeting my gaze with a tired but stern expression. As much as you've acted like an idiot, I still love you. And when Nathan doesn't need me anymore, I'll be back full time. I stared at her, trying to make sense of her words. And what am I supposed to do in the meantime? I asked, my voice shaking with frustration. Right now? Cool off. I'm packing a few things and staying with Nathan for a few days until you can handle this like an adult. She turned back to the closet, pulling out a small suitcase. And the kids? I pressed, hoping to guilt her into reconsidering. If you don't want to take care of them, call my parents, she said dismissively, not even looking at me. They'll step in. She zipped up her bag and walked out, leaving me frozen in place, my head spinning. For the kids' sake, I knew I had to keep myself together, but inside, I was unraveling. I wasn't going to take this lying down, no self-respecting man would. I checked on the kids, finding them at the dining table. Hey, do you have any homework? I asked, trying to sound normal. They groaned in unison, but I coaxed them into focusing with the promise of a trip to their grandparents' house later. They lit up at the idea. Lindsay's parents, Frank and Mary, were a big part of their lives. Frank, who they called Pop, was helping them build go-karts in his workshop. He was a retired tinkerer who had a knack for keeping the kids entertained with hands-on projects. Sometimes, I joined in too, bringing my skills as a mechanic from the Ford dealership. Those were the moments that reminded me what family was supposed to feel like. But this visit wasn't just for the kids. I needed to talk to Frank and Mary. Maybe they knew something about Nathan. Maybe they could help me make sense of all this. I trusted them, always had. They'd been like second parents to me since mine lived far away. But now, I wasn't so sure. Would they side with Lindsay? As I watched the kids bent over their books, I felt a pang of guilt and pride. They deserved so much better than this chaos. Ethan, at 16, was my firstborn and my rock. He had a heart as big as his ambition, but he wasn't quite big enough for a football scholarship, a fact that frustrated him endlessly. Still, he gave it his all every day. Then there was Emily, 15, whip-smart and independent, with just enough teenage rebellion to remind me of her mother's fiery spirit. She was excelling in school, but I could see the strain of all this starting to weigh on her. And finally, Noah, my 11-year-old surprise. He was our happy accident, the glue that often held us together with his infectious laugh and boundless energy. Looking at them, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. Lindsay might be wrapped up in her new reality, but I had to fight for mine. For them. For us. Even if it felt like my world was falling apart, I wasn't about to let it crumble without a fight. I made myself a strong cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table with a notebook, determined to get some clarity. My mind was spinning, but I knew I needed to take control of the situation. The first step was making a list of things to do. At the top of that list was calling my boss, Bob Marshall. I've worked at the dealership since it opened 23 years ago, and Bob has been my boss for the last 15. He's a fair man, tough but understanding, and he'd always treated me more like a friend than just an employee. When he picked up, I hesitated for a moment before filling him in on what was happening. Bob, I began, trying to keep my voice steady. Lindsay dropped a bombshell on me yesterday. It's a mess, and I don't even know where to start. He listened quietly, and when I finished, his voice was heavy with sympathy. Adam, I'm so sorry to hear this. I've seen my son, Gary, go through something similar, and it nearly destroyed him. What happened? I asked, both curious and horrified at what else could go wrong in situations like this. Bob sighed. Gary's ex-wife, Carol, accused him of abusing their daughter. It was brutal. For a week, we were waiting for the police to show up and arrest him. Those kinds of accusations are devastating and nearly impossible to disprove. The worst part is, the system doesn't even give you the benefit of the doubt, one accusation, and they're ready to act. Good grief, I said, shaking my head. That's one cold move. What happened? It was Carol's own mother, Bev, who saved Gary. God bless that woman. Carol had told her mom that Gary mistreated their daughter, thinking it would ruin him. But Bev, she's known for being ruthless but fair, wasn't about to take her word for it. She took the girl to a doctor immediately, and the doctor confirmed that nothing had happened. Bev marched to the police herself and threatened to testify against her daughter if they pursued charges. She also warned Carol that she'd expose her pill addiction and fight for custody of her granddaughter if she didn't stop this nonsense. Wow, I said, stunned by the story. Bev must be some kind of saint. It's shocking what some people will do to get their way. Amen to that, Bob replied bitterly. If there's anything I can do to help you, Adam, let me know. If it's in my power, I'll make it happen. Grateful for his support, I asked for the next week off, using my vacation and personal days. Bob not only agreed but told me to take more time if I needed it. Thanks, Bob, I said, feeling a mix of relief and embarrassment. Take care of yourself, Adam, he said firmly. And don't be afraid to reach out. After ending the call, I turned my attention to my next step, legal advice. I made an appointment with Dwight Harper, a lawyer I'd used before for some minor estate planning. He was sharp and no nonsense, and I trusted him to give me a clear picture of what I was up against. Later that afternoon, I sat across from Dwight in his office, recounting everything that had happened. He listened intently, jotting down notes. When I mentioned that Lindsay claimed to still love me but planned to keep seeing Nathan, his pen stopped mid-sentence. Wait a minute, Dwight said, his expression hardening. You're telling me your wife says she loves you, but she's going to keep seeing this guy? Feeling humiliated, I nodded. Unbelievable, Dwight muttered, shaking his head. All right, go on. I explained how Lindsay became furious when I refused to accept her plan and how I'd lashed out, calling her names in my frustration. Dwight leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. Look, Adam, I'll be honest with you. Legally, infidelity doesn't hold much weight these days. Even if you have proof of the affair, it won't impact the division of your assets. The courts focus on splitting things fairly and ensuring the kids' well-being. You may have to pay alimony and child support, regardless of what Lindsay has done. His words hit me like a gut punch. Even with Dwight's reassurance that he'd fight to protect my rights, the idea of losing so much, my family, my finances, left me feeling completely deflated. Still, as I left his office, I reminded myself that I wasn't alone in this fight. My kids needed me, and I wasn't about to let this situation break me. I'd find a way forward, one step at a time. Yes, it's possible you could lose a lot, Dwight said, his brow furrowed as he reviewed his notes. But that's why we need to move quickly. Your wife has left the marital home and, worse, left your kids at her lover's house. That's a huge red flag in the eyes of many courts. Right now, you technically have custody, and we'll do everything we can to keep it that way. I nodded, trying to absorb everything he was saying. Dwight leaned forward, his tone steady and serious. Here's the plan. I'll file an emergency motion for custody and request a temporary restraining order to prevent Lindsay from coming back to the house or within 500 feet of you and the kids. Her actions, leaving her children in that situation, work heavily against her. It was hard to process the gravity of his words, but Dwight's confidence kept me focused. Now, he continued, flipping through his notes, we need to address your finances. You and Lindsay have a shared checking and savings account, plus CDs, withdraw half of the funds and transfer them into a separate account in your name only. It's within your rights, but don't take more than half. That'll keep you protected without raising unnecessary red flags. I hesitated. Will that look bad in court? Dwight shook his head. Not if you stick to half. It's a precaution, Adam. She's already made her priorities clear, and you need to protect yourself and your kids. I thought about our financial situation. Lindsay and I both had retirement accounts, though hers was slightly smaller since she worked part-time at the hospital. While her benefits were solid, my company offered a better healthcare plan, which we relied on for the family. We owned 2 cars, both in both our names, and a house with little equity. We'd maxed out the loan when we bought it a few years ago. Understood, I said finally. Dwight stood, his face set with determination. Get the banking done today. I'll prepare the petition for custody and the restraining order immediately. With the judge being a family friend of your father's, I can reach out to him at home if needed. Don't worry, Adam, we'll fight this. I shook his hand, feeling a small but crucial sense of hope. After leaving Dwight's office, I headed straight to the bank. It felt surreal, sitting there and dividing the funds that Lindsay and I had worked so hard to save. I tried not to think about what brought me here as I signed the paperwork for the new account. By the time I got home, exhaustion had set in, both physical and emotional. The kids were playing outside when I pulled into the driveway. They greeted me with smiles, but I could barely muster one in return. Stay outside for a few minutes, okay? I told them, my voice sharper than I intended. Ethan, my oldest, noticed the strain on my face. Sure, Dad, he said quickly, ushering his siblings back toward the yard. Inside, I collapsed onto the couch, my head in my hands as the weight of the day finally broke through. Silent tears slid down my face. I thought I was alone until I heard a voice behind me. She told you, didn't she? I turned to see Mary, Lindsay's mother, standing in the doorway. She and her husband, Frank, had just arrived. Yes, I replied firmly, recounting the events of the last 24 hours, including Lindsay's threats and insults. Mary looked shocked, while Frank's face darkened with anger. I still can't believe it, he muttered, shaking his head. I'm calling her right now. This is unbelievable. He pulled out his phone, dialed Lindsay, and put it on speaker. When she picked up, her tone was defensive from the start. Dad, I don't want to talk about this right now. No, you're going to listen, Frank interrupted, his voice like steel. How could you do this to Adam and your children? You've disgraced this family. There was a long silence on the line. Lindsay, who had always been quick with comebacks, seemed completely stunned. I can't talk to you when you're like this, she finally said and hung up. Frank slammed his phone down on the table, his hands shaking. I'm so sorry, Adam, he said, his voice breaking. I never thought my daughter would behave this way. We'll help you any way we can. Mary nodded, her own eyes filled with tears. Let me speak to her later when I've calmed down. Right now, I'm too angry to say anything helpful. I thanked them both, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. Their support meant everything, but the fact that it was needed at all cut me to the core. As I gathered the kids and headed out to meet the locksmith I'd scheduled, I resolved to keep fighting. My kids deserved better than this, and so did I. Lindsay might have thrown our life into chaos, but I wasn't going to let her destroy what mattered most. I hugged Frank and Mary tightly, overwhelmed by their unwavering support. Why don't you stay for dinner? I asked, hoping their presence would bring some stability for the kids. The day felt like a blur. My mind kept replaying the confrontation with Lindsay. Her words, so sharp and cruel, cut deeper than I thought possible. Calling me a middle-aged man no other woman would want wasn't just an insult, it felt like an intentional blow, designed to humiliate me. When Lindsay returned later that evening to collect more of her things, I knew I couldn't let her leave without saying my piece. "Lindsay," I began, standing firm at the door, "you keep saying you love me, but how am I supposed to believe that? Everything you've said and done makes a mockery of love. You threaten to ruin me if I file for divorce. Is that what love looks like to you?" Her expression softened for a moment. "Adam, I didn't mean those things," she said quietly. "I was angry because of the names you called me." I shook my head. "I was angry too, Lindsay, but what you've done goes far beyond words. You broke our vows, the promises we made to love, honor, and cherish each other. What happened to those?" Her face hardened again, her voice sharp. "This isn't an affair. Nathan is the only person I've been with since we married, and I'm not abandoning him. He's hurting, Adam, and I'm not going to stop helping him just because you don't approve." I let out a bitter laugh. "Suit yourself, Lindsay. But don't expect me to go along with this. I don't trust you anymore, and I'll be ordering DNA tests to confirm Ethan and Emily are mine." Her face flushed with anger, and her voice trembled. "You're such a jerk," she spat. "If you think this is ugly now, just wait. I'll make you regret this." "Go ahead," I said coldly. "Move in with Nathan. Give him your love. Or is he just using you for his own gain?" Lindsay stormed past me, throwing the last of her things into her bag. Once she was done, I called Ethan and Emily inside to say goodbye. Emily ran to her mother, tears streaming down her face. "Please don't go, Mom," she cried, holding onto Lindsay tightly. Lindsay's own tears flowed as she hugged her daughter. "Adam," she pleaded, looking over Emily's head, "can't you see what this is doing to them?" "You're the one walking away," I said firmly. Lindsay kissed Emily on the forehead and gently let her go before heading to her car. Ethan, standing silently, stepped forward to comfort his sister as Lindsay drove away. Frank approached me then, placing a steady hand on my shoulder. "I'm so sorry, Adam," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I never thought my daughter would do something like this. But Mary and I are here for you. We'll help however we can." Mary nodded, her expression solemn. "I'll talk to her later, when I've calmed down. Right now, I'm too upset to say anything useful." Later that evening, Frank and Mary stayed for dinner. I had planned to grill burgers, but Mary took over in the kitchen, whipping up her famous meatloaf and macaroni and cheese, the kids' favorite. As the comforting aroma of dinner filled the house, I found a small moment of peace. Even Emily, who had been inconsolable earlier, began to smile faintly as her grandparents distracted her with stories and jokes. Still, the weight of what lay ahead pressed heavily on me. Lindsay had already hired a lawyer, Amber Wright. Dwight had mentioned her earlier. "She's tough," he'd said. "But we're tougher." For now, I clung to that thought. The fight was just beginning, but I wasn't backing down. Amber wasn't as skilled as she thought. She tried to overturn the restraining order, but Judge Johnson stood firm, only modifying it to allow Lindsay supervised visits at the house. The key condition was that her boyfriend, Nathan, could not be present or within 500 feet of the property. He warned Lindsay that any violation of this order would immediately terminate her visitation rights. At first, Lindsay seemed relieved by the ruling, but her satisfaction quickly faded when the judge ordered her to pay child support. The financial strain forced her to return to full-time work, a decision she clearly resented. While Mary offered to supervise the visits, I insisted on being there for the first one to set clear boundaries. On the first Monday of her visit, Lindsay arrived in a car I didn't recognize, undoubtedly Nathan's. She stepped out nervously, flashing a tentative smile. "Hello, Adam," she greeted softly. "How are you, Mother?" Before Mary could respond, I cut in sharply. "Lindsay, he needs to leave." Confusion flickered across her face. "What do you mean?" "The judge said your lover can't be within 500 feet of this house," I snapped, my anger bubbling over. "Are you completely brain dead?" Horror spread across Lindsay's face. "But, he was just dropping me off." "I don't care." "The judge's order was crystal clear," I said, my voice rising. Mary, visibly stunned, stepped forward with an expression that silenced the tension. "Lindsay, if you ever disrespect Adam again, I will tear that dress off you and tan your behind red. Is that clear?" Lindsay blinked, clearly bewildered, and then nodded meekly. She walked inside to wait for the kids, visibly shaken by her mother's stern intervention. Mary turned to me with a sympathetic look. "Adam, I'm sorry for my brain-dead daughter. She's lucky you're willing to tolerate this at all." "Thanks for sticking up for me," I said gratefully, touched by her unwavering support. By the second week of supervised visits, Lindsay's arrogance had started to crumble. During one particularly calm moment, Mary gently questioned her. "Lindsay," Mary began, "how would you feel if Adam started seeing someone else? If he moved on and found happiness with another woman?" I cringed, expecting Lindsay to lash out or attack my manhood, but she didn't respond right away. Instead, she seemed uncomfortable, fidgeting with her hands as she avoided the question. I didn't care about her answer. The drawn-out divorce process had already taught me not to expect reason from her. In the meantime, I decided to channel my frustration into self-improvement. When someone you love tells you you're not good enough, there's a part of you that wants to prove them wrong. So, I made some changes. First, I decided to undergo hair transplant surgery. It cost $4,000, and I debated whether it was worth it, but in the end, I needed it, for me. I also started a strict diet and exercise routine, determined to shed the weight Lindsay had used as a weapon against my confidence. Over a few months, I lost 18 pounds. One day during a visit, Mary gave me a warm smile. "Adam, there's something different about you," she said. I blushed slightly. "Oh, I've just been on a diet," I admitted. "I've lost 18 pounds. Mary's smile widened. "Well, whatever you're doing, keep it up. You're looking good, Adam." Her encouragement meant more than I could say. For the first time in months, I felt like I was reclaiming a piece of myself, and that was worth every ounce of effort. "I'm aiming to lose another 5 pounds, I said with a grin. Mary laughed and nodded approvingly. "Well, it really suits you. If I weren't married, Adam, I'd be all over you." I chuckled awkwardly. "Thanks for the ego boost. But according to Lindsay, I'm just a middle-aged man with no appeal, so much so that she went out and found herself a lover." I tried to turn it into a joke, but the words fell flat. By now, everyone at the dealership knew about my situation. It wasn't exactly something I wanted to be public knowledge, but gossip travels fast, and my messy personal life had become the talk of the break room. The therapy sessions with and continued, but they felt pointless. Lindsay clung stubbornly to her beliefs, insisting that her affair wasn't just acceptable, it was necessary. She claimed she was doing what was best for herself and Nathan while still loving me and the children. If Adam could accept that the intimacy is very fulfilling and that Nathan takes care of me emotionally, then I think we could make this work, Lindsay said, her tone earnest as though she were suggesting something reasonable. I could barely keep myself composed and tried to gently challenge Lindsay's stance. "But Lindsay," and began, "how would you feel if Adam decided to find intimacy with another woman? If he moved on and shared the same kind of bond you have with Nathan?" Lindsay hesitated for a moment before shaking her head. "If he promised to ensure the children and I were taken care of, then I'd accept it." The words stung, even though I'd expected them. These sessions weren't about healing or reconciliation. They were just Lindsay's attempts to justify her actions. With the initial shock of Lindsay's betrayal behind me, I decided it was time to take action. I'd always dreamed of starting my own business, and now seemed like the right time to make that dream a reality. I approached Frank with the idea, knowing he had the resources I needed to get started. I want to set up my own repair shop, I explained. But I can't just quit my job and go all in. I don't have the money to support the kids while the business takes off. We'd be starving before I made a profit. Frank, ever supportive, offered me a solution. You know, my old barn-turned-workshop has plenty of space. Why don't you start there? It's zoned for industrial use, and you'll have everything you need to get started. It was perfect. Frank's workshop, originally built for tinkering and small projects, had more than enough room for us to work side by side. With his encouragement, I started small, taking on jobs by word of mouth while continuing my full-time job at the dealership. Soon, I found myself juggling more work than I could handle. On weekdays, I fixed cars at the dealership, and on weekends, I handled my own growing list of clients. It was exhausting but rewarding. The decision to go full-time came to a head when the dealership asked me to work over the weekend to catch up on a backlog of repairs. I couldn't do it, I already had customers of my own waiting. I knew this would be a breaking point. Got a minute, Bob? I asked, poking my head into his office. Sure, Adam, Bob said, gesturing for me to come in. I stepped inside, nervous but determined. I've been thinking a lot about my future, I began. I want to spend more time with my kids and focus on building my own business. I can't keep up with both, and I know I've got obligations here, but... Bob held up his hand. Adam, I'd hate to lose you, he said sincerely. You've been a valuable part of this team for years. But tell me about your business, where are you set up, and what kind of work are you doing? I explained everything, from my setup at Frank's workshop to the types of repairs I was handling. Bob listened thoughtfully, nodding as I spoke. Well, it sounds like you're off to a great start, he said. I'm sad to see you go, but I understand. Family comes first. If you ever need a reference, or even want to come back, you know where to find me. Thanks, Bob, I said, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. I appreciate everything you've done for me. With that, I officially stepped away from the dealership and into a new chapter of my life. It was daunting, but for the first time in months, I felt hopeful. This wasn't just about proving Lindsay wrong, it was about reclaiming my sense of purpose and creating a better future for me and my kids. I explained to Bob that I had set up my operation on my father-in-law Frank's property. I described the equipment and tools I had access to, emphasizing that I was equipped to handle almost any kind of car repair, including bodywork. Bob listened intently, then leaned back in his chair. Go get yourself a cup of coffee and then come back here, he said with a small smile. After that pivotal weekend, my business took off, becoming a full-time venture. Occasionally, I would still go into the dealership if they had a problem that needed my expertise and I wasn't too busy. Frank started helping me part-time in the shop, and Mary offered to handle the bookkeeping. With their support, I found myself making more money than I ever had while working at the dealership. The only part of my life that still felt broken was my marriage. By the fourth counseling session with Anne, I was ready to call it quits. I had long since stopped caring about what Lindsay was doing with Nathan. Even hearing about their relationship no longer provoked anger, it just left me feeling empty. The sessions themselves felt futile. Lindsay was stubborn, and her refusal to take responsibility only deepened the divide between us. During one particularly tense session, she became agitated and defensive when Anne pressed her about her priorities. Eventually, Anne ended the session and gave us homework to complete before the next meeting. The homework was a list of questions. Some of them made sense, like assessing our relationships with our parents or discussing the state of our intimacy. Other questions seemed trivial to me, like asking about my favorite food or drink or the type of vehicle I drove. But then I hit one question that stopped me in my tracks: what is your ultimate goal in this relationship? That question lingered in my mind for days. It made me confront the harsh reality that I no longer had a clear answer. Did I want to repair things for the sake of the kids? Was there even anything left to repair? The truth was, I didn't know anymore. By the next session, I had resolved to be honest, no matter how difficult it was. I explained to Anne and Lindsay that I didn't harbor resentment toward Nathan. It wasn't hard to find out his name, but I had no interest in confronting him. I just don't care anymore, I said plainly. I want to move on. Lindsay looked up at me with the saddest eyes I'd ever seen. For a moment, I felt a pang of guilt. I hated seeing her in pain. A part of me wanted to go over and hug her, to comfort her. But I knew that wouldn't solve anything. So I continued, my voice steady. I know your lawyer hasn't been happy with the settlement I've offered so far. Well, I've told my attorney to make some adjustments. Take what you need, Lindsay. You can support Nathan however you want, but I think it's time to finalize this divorce. If for no other reason, do it so you can start rebuilding a relationship with Ethan and Emily. Lindsay burst into tears and fled the room, leaving both Anne and me stunned. Anne composed herself after a moment and turned to me. For the next session, I'd like to see Lindsay alone, she said carefully. And then I'll meet with you one-on-one for the final session. I sighed but nodded in agreement. That's fine, I said. I don't think there's much more to talk about at this point anyway. As I left Anne's office, I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders. I didn't feel triumphant or vindicated, just relieved. It was time to close this chapter and move forward, for the sake of myself and my kids. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I could see a path ahead. I was furious as Anne began reading from her notes. One particular question from our counseling sessions had caught her attention. Adam, Anne said, pulling 2 sheets of paper from her folder, do you remember the question, if you could change one thing, what would it be? I nodded, already bracing myself for what she was about to say. Well, she continued, your answer was, I wish I could have been a better husband so that my wife wouldn't have stopped loving me. As the words left her mouth, Lindsay broke down, sobbing harder than I'd ever seen. For a moment, I froze, unsure of what to say or do. Eventually, I just sat there, letting her cry it out. It took a long time for her to calm down, and even then, the tension in the room was suffocating. And looked at me carefully. Adam, I think Lindsay feels like she's already lost you completely. That realization is hitting her hard. I thought about what Anne said, but ultimately, it didn't change my mind. Too much had happened, and there was no way to undo the damage. My life was finally back on track, and I was determined to move forward. Most importantly, I could never trust Lindsay again. What I wanted more than anything was for the kids to rebuild their bond with their mother. Emily's grades had dropped significantly since this mess began, and she still held deep resentment toward Lindsay. Ethan had grown distant and withdrawn, and he was acting out in school in ways I'd never seen before. They deserved better than the chaos Lindsay had brought into our lives, and it was time to prioritize their well-being. Later, Anne revealed something that caught me off guard. Adam, there's something else you should know about Nathan, she said cautiously. What is it? I asked, curious but detached. The story Lindsay believes about his wife's death isn't entirely true, Anne explained. His wife didn't die in the car accident because of circumstances beyond anyone's control. She died after catching him cheating. She left their home in a rage, speeding away and crashing. That's the real story. I was stunned but not surprised. And why did Nathan leave town? I asked. Anne hesitated. It wasn't just guilt. He was severely beaten outside a local bar, 5 broken ribs, a busted kneecap, 5 missing teeth, and other injuries. He left town after that. I stared at her for a moment, then shrugged. It doesn't matter to me. My focus isn't on Nathan or what happens to him, it's on my kids and my future. 3 years later, I remarried. My new wife? Emily's teacher. How we met and everything that happened in between is a story for another time, but what matters is this: Ethan and Emily love her, and she's become an essential part of our family. Lindsay, however, still hasn't fully accepted that I've moved on. She continues to act as though I'm waiting for her to come back, but I've made my peace with the situation. As far as I'm concerned, the matter is settled. Lindsay can either accept it or she can't, that's her problem now. My focus is on the family I've built, the happiness I've found, and the life I've worked hard to rebuild.